Hello, hello. Welcome back to the Sanibel Online Writers Conference. We're not on the island, but we are there in spirit, I guess, right now. And I've got two very accomplished writers with me for this session. I'm going to introduce them and then kind of duck out of the way here. Camille Dungy and Jeffrey Thompson, both very accomplished writers, like I said, and accomplished poets. But what they're going to talk about today a little bit is about writing in different genres, and specifically in poetry and nonfiction. And like I said, they've both done a lot of writing, had a lot of published work. One of Camille's most recent publications is a collection of essays called Guidebook to Relative Strangers, Journeys into Race, Motherhood, and History. And then Jeff's published Half-Life, New and Selected Poems, not too long ago, and he also has a memoir titled Fragile. So they have tons of expertise in both of these genres and a lot of experience. And their session today is titled Draw the Line, Poetry and Nonfiction. So without further ado, thanks so much for joining us, guys. And I'm going to pass it over to Jeff and Camille.
Fantastic.
All right.
Jeff, you're on the East Coast, so the sun hits you first. You should open us up.
Pretty tree out right outside my window that's getting a lot of sun, which is why I feel well lit. Do you want me to start?
I do.
Okay. So I thought I would start with these couple of stories that maybe will lead us into this discussion about the distinction between how things get written in poetry and how things get written in memoir, which is where I'm really going to focus. So when I was a long time ago, when I was married, just got married, my wife and I were on our honeymoon. We were in Trinidad and Tobago, and we took a boat trip out into the Coroni Swamp in Trinidad to see the scarlet ibis. And we took this really sort of super fast boat through the jungle and rainforest and came out into this lagoon where we sat for a while as the sun was going down, looking at this one mangrove tree in the middle, group of mangroves in the middle. And as the sun set, the scarlet ibis came out of the sky one by one and just filled up the tree like a Christmas tree of birds, bright scarlet red, obviously. And just a spectacular sort of moment. And I've carried that moment for a long time. And then sort of the theme for all these stories is birds, by the way, right? And so Sanibel obviously also has that great bird watching sanctuary that I love to go to when I'm down there. Years later, I've started to take students to Costa Rica every couple of years to do an environmental writing trip. And we are in this other canal system, and the rain is coming down super hard like it does. And, we got these big hoods up, these big ponchos that they've given us. So we look like a group of convicts being taken upriver. And the rain breaks open suddenly, and the sun comes streaming in. The clouds are beautiful in the background, and there's this beautiful tiger hair in there right on the corner as we round the thing. And because it's been sitting there in the rain for a while too, it's soaking wet and it wants to dry out. So it sticks its wings out like this, catching the sun. And that's another one of these moments for me. And the third one is I was with my son on another trip in the rainforest. And we were going with my friend who's a guide, and we were looking for the great green macaws. And we find the macaws in the top of an almond tree. And so we see them with the scope, and they're beautiful, and there's huge birds. They're squawking and sort of magical. And they're pretty rare even in Costa Rica. So I wrote a poem about these three experiences, and what I did was I just jammed them all together, and they sort of happen one after another. There's no sense that they might be different or in different times or separated by different senses of who I was as a person, and they worked, and they worked together because they were all connected by image and language. And then when I was working on the memoir, I was going back because this is all about memory and this is all about life in my past. I was playing around with some of these same memories. And I started to do that same thing, basically just jamming them together a little bit by just juxtaposition. And that felt wrong in a way that it didn't feel wrong with the poems at all. And I had to spend more time with those moments. I had to put them in context. I had to say, this is where I am. This is who I am. And I had to fess up. I couldn't do the things that I was doing with the poem in the prose. And this is, I think, one of the distinctions that I want to make. And I want to finish my collection of stories so Camille can talk. But this idea that, and then Tracy K. Smith talks about this as being the insistence of poetry versus the persistence of memoir or persistence of prose. The poem can insist based on the precision of its language, the use of image, the connections, the sort of syntactic connections or synaptic connections that poems can make. And prose can't do that. Prose needs a little bit more space to breathe. Prose needs a little bit more truth, and prose needs a little bit of truth in a sort of factual way, memoir in particular. And there's this, and that's what I wanted to think about, this drawing the line, right? That poems can do things that memoir can, and memoir can do things that poems can't. But there is a sort of strange line in that connection. So maybe I'll just stop there and let Camille jump in, and then we can sort of deal with questions or thoughts and expand on things that you might want to talk about more.
That sounds good. So I actually published two collections in the same year. So there was the essay collection, Guidebook to Relative Strangers, that was published in early summer of 2017. And in February of 2017, I published a collection of poetry. They were accruing at the same time. So for me, it's not necessarily a matter of I have my poetry hat on for this number of years and my essay writing or prose writing hat on for this number of years. It's about where, much as Jeffrey says, where the image or the insistence that I'm concentrating on and meditating on, the kind of attention that kernel or nugget demands. And I can tell you one thing about one of the reasons that I found myself turning to prose more, though I was trained as a poet. And I will then point out that by that, I mean my formal academic, what I have my MFA in was poetry. But I think to be a writer, you have to be a reader. And you really have to be a voracious and eclectic reader. You have to read everything, all the things, all of the backs of the cereal boxes and all of the poems and the novels and the memoirs and the, for me, like, natural history collections and things like that, right? So I was also always training as a prose writer too, because I'm thinking about how those kinds of ways of disseminating information and feeling show themselves. And there's a question that popped up, do I have a preference to read poetry and prose? And I don't think that is, I don't think so. I think that I have a preference to read work that engages me, and the shape in which it arrives can be part of the excitement, but is not, the categorization is not the thing that is as crucial to me. So for me, I had a small child, I had a kid, and that changed how I could write, because it changed the amount of time that I had at any stretch. And my training as a poet was in what I have come to call the person from Porlock school, playing on that Coleridge poem in Kubla Khan, where the person from Porlock interrupts his meditation, and the speaker of the poem complains that he will never be able to get back to this wonderful reverie and dreamlike meditation again. The poem is ruined because somebody knocked on the door. But when you have a small person in your home, there's a person from Porlock knocking on your door all the time. And so I had to retool. I had to retrain how to be a poet with those kinds of interruptions. I knew it was possible. Some of my most revered models are poets who were mothers, often of multiple children. And so I knew that it was a thing that I could do, but it was not a way that I had been trained to write. I had been really trained to write in that bubble. But what I could do outside of that bubble, what I could do with all kinds of interruptions, was write prose. I could be interrupted in the middle of a sentence in prose. And because prose for me is driven by content, driven by idea, driven by the kind of story that I want to tell, the message that I want to make, and that's the tractor pull of a poem, as opposed to, the tractor pull of an essay for me is that intention. Whereas for me, the tractor pull of a poem is discovering how the constellations of sounds and images will begin to accrue and reveal their intention. So I often sit down to an essay and think, I'm really going to write about this experience that I had. And in the process of writing about this experience that I had, images will reveal themselves. Sonic kind of play will show up. But that's the second thing that shows up, as opposed to in a poem. That's what leads the feeling and the drive. And so as I retrained how to be a writer and a mother, I changed my mode of writing. I changed the genre in which I was writing. But I think that you'll often find, as Jeffrey just said, you'll often find the preoccupations of the writer's mind reveal themselves across platforms, right? And so there's something about the thing in this writer's life that you see in their fiction, and you see it come up again in their poetry, and you see it come up again in their nonfiction. And it's just the direction by which we come to access the revelations that change for me. So that's my general thing. I also feel like this is almost a political insistence on not observing these cultural delineations that we are so tied to in the 20th and early 21st century. Like this ease for where we put something in the bookstore, where it gets categorized in the library, I think is actually a little bit contradictory to how artists really create. I believe that there is a lot of fluidity between poetry and nonfiction, that they're kissing cousins in a lot of the impulses of these two genres. And there's some ease. There's definitely some poems in Trophic Cascade that almost are essays. They're long. Some of them are not even lineated. They're telling a story of a journey in the same way that Guidebook to Relative Strangers is entirely a collection about stories about journeys, right? And so what made that a poem that showed up in the book of poems as opposed to an essay that showed up in the collection of essays is almost just a judgment call, that I think that we need to be open to a lot more fluidity in what we're asking of our writers. I just got this awesome deck of playing cards of genius writers, and I'd say about a quarter of the writers that we would be considered genius writers in that deck of playing cards write across genres. And that's part of what makes them so amazing, is their ability to be fluid.
One of the things that I use, one of the metaphors that I use sometimes with my students is for the poem, it can be this moment in time. It can be this spot, like Wordsworth's spots of time. But the memoir or the prose moment is the moment like that you have on the massage table when the massage therapist is putting her thumb right down on that pressure point and holding it there and holding it there and holding it there until there's a kind of release. And sometimes that pressure point is a moment of crisis or a moment of struggle with you. Sometimes it's just that spot of time. But the prose moment seems to me, as Camille said, not a different thing itself, but a different way of exploring the same thing, right? And the technique or the approach, it can vary. It can be moderated by your choice or by listening to the material itself. Part of it is, what does your piece of writing want to look like? What does it want to do? Does it need time to spread out? Does it need time to be sort of held there and just examined? Or is it a moment of sort of much more precise intensity, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are some ways in which prose holds room for research and backstory and data and just like sheer just facts and numbers and figures and names and historical connections and at great length that the mind needs at times.
Yeah.
The mind needs at times to just stay for 5 pages on information about whatever this is. And though poetry has a place for that, I think of some just phenomenal poets of the what we would call now the docu-poetic tradition. Lorene Niedecker and her poems Lake Superior, and Muriel Rukeyser's Book of the Dead. Those are 2 kind of classics in that tradition that have space for history and geological facts and interviews and data. But those are also when they were written, they were really stretching the capacity for what a poem was expected to be able to hold. I think a lot of contemporary poets are working in that model because we have so much information that needs to be conveyed. Right? We're in a moment of great kind of general wide crisis, and to be able to really understand that crisis on a public level and a personal level, it really means a kind of diving into history and facts and data and doing that kind of interview. And how poetry holds that kind of long exploration and how prose does is really different. And I sometimes find myself enjoying what the space that no line break and no expectation for length that being able to write an essay gives me to really dive in deep and long into these kinds of contextual material. Whereas for me, often poetry relies on a understanding that the readership already has an understanding of what this context is out of which it's coming. And when I have to provide that context, that becomes a different challenge for me for poetry.
And it does seem to happen in poetry more in the book project now, right? The book is that space where the larger context of that can be explored. I mean, we're in a time of pandemic, and I think about Ellen Bryant Voigt's Kyrie, which is this long sequence of voices from the 1919 flu pandemic. And any one of those single voices isn't about the flu. I mean, some of them are, but you get the larger sense of the war, World War I. You get a larger sense of what people were doing. You get that in the space of the book rather than in the individual poem. But yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think some part of it has to do with this drawing the line question, right? Because if we were to look at some of the poets who I think do the best kind of thing of this sort of long, in-depth, highly contextual meditation. A lot of that work is not the case for Kyrie, which is a collection of sonnets, but a lot of the time those are unlineated poems, right? So there's that really fantastic relatively new book called Literature for Non-Humans by Gabriel Guttings, right? And most of that work is non-lineated. Juliana Spahr writes a lot of really fantastic environmental and social justice poetry, and is often playing against what the line does. And so where I'm going with this is I think that there's something also about the demands of lineation that also change the trajectory of a meditation, and that sometimes it's fun to and freeing to be able to just, as I said earlier, just write with no limit of where that line's going to break and where the margin and where my reader's attention has to shift and change and reconstruct itself every point at the end of the line. I want to be able to just hold that reader's attention steadily for the duration of numerous paragraphs before I ask them to do the kind of switching that lineation requires. Poetry, prose, and spoken word, can the relationship between the three be concisely described, Jeffrey? And there was a question earlier about whether or not you leaned into a particular genre, depending on your audience. And it seems like these two questions could go together.
Yeah. I mean, I like Camille, I was trained as a poet. That's my official, but that's on my degree. But like all poets have to read everybody. Poets have to read prose. Poets read prose, and so and there's writers in prose. So I'm trying to think of a way to connect these three things. I think there's an expansiveness to prose in general that that poetry and maybe spoken word don't have, and there's an intensity and an interiority in poetry that spoken word doesn't have, and there's the performance aspect of the experience of the speaker that spoken word doesn't have, that spoken word has, that the other two don't. So it's sort of like the rock paper scissors question. Like each one has its strengths and its has its weaknesses. Some things really don't work in poems as well as they do in prose. Some things need that, as Camille was saying, you need to be able to take that historical look or the backstory, or you need to be able to respond to the character that you are on the page in different ways. So that, but yeah, I also want to say that they're all kissing cousins. They're all related to one another. This all comes out of a time when we were, we didn't write anything down and we did everything orally, and we learned information orally. And if you go back to to antiquity, people would have these long didactic poems about how you take care of your beehives and how you plant corn or whatever, and they would be in poetry because that's the way people held information for a long time, was orally, and lineation and line and rhyme and meter were means of memory. So, I mean, I think maybe it's my bias as a trained poet, but I think they all sort of go back to that all writing generally goes back to poetry because that's the way we started.
Yeah. I think I've been hearing this, I guess it's a complaint recently. I do a lot of environmental writing, and I've been hearing this thing that I'm going to call a complaint, that there's no pleasure in reading contemporary environmental poetry, because it's talks so frequently about environmental degradation and catastrophic climate change and species die off and depressing stuff. And this complaint comes from this category of people who expect to go to poetry purely for pleasure and for pretty sounds and kind of light entertainment. And I've never subscribed to that as my requirement for poetry, so I don't experience this as a particularly valid or behavior changing complaint on my part. But what I will say is that people don't pick up a memoir or an essay and expect it to be light and easy and not challenge them in some way, right? I mean, in fact, we go to memoir very frequently to be titillated and shocked and amazed by the survival skills of the people about who have written their memoir, right? And so if we turn to this question of audience, that was part of the question that we received earlier, there is a way in which you are already ready when you pick up one of my collections of essays or one of my memoirs for me to talk about things that may be challenging, may be difficult to read, may be convicting to you as a reader in some way, and asking you where you might participate in that kind of change. There is space for that in poetry. There has long and always been space for that in poetry. But there's also very frequently an audience expectation that poetry is rhymey or pretty or kind of inviting in that kind of way. And so to be participating for me as an environmental writer, as an African-American writer, as a feminist writer, right? All of these kinds of aspects of my person, which then infuse my poems, I'm all often kind of threading a line with poetry of how audience perception is going to happen with one of those books as opposed to a book of essays. So again, I don't understand this complaint as something that will change my behavior as a writer on the page, but I do understand it as a fact of who will pick up either book and what kind of responses they're going to have to either book.
Yeah, and the audience expectations for poetry seem to be, they're always complicated, right? Can poems be funny? Can they be smart alecky? Can you write poems about science fiction? Can you write and these are, I don't know. I think you're right. I think that's coming from the audience in the publishing world of poetry rather than poets, because poets do weird stuff, right? And it's sort of what gets celebrated and talked about. So I think that's complicated as well. there are writers doing writerly things in writerly ways that are complicated and multi-genre and multi subject based. I'm thinking about like Franny Choi's book Soft Science. That's a very strange and interesting book, and there's lots of cyborg poems, but there's also lots of sort of poems about her as a her sexuality and her choices of her partners and those things, and the way she deals with political ramifications of the current situation, and all those things are coming together in that book, and they're not separate. They're just part of the work of the book. So I don't know where I'm going with this, but I'm trying to expand on what you said because I think it's right.
We don't have enough funny poems. It's true. There are a lot of them, though. and delightful, and there's something also about like what humor looks like what do we expect? I mean, I'm thinking Matea Harvey to me is funny as heck, but it's not light humor. I think Lucille Clifton is often incredibly funny in her poems, but again, the place out of which that humor comes is that sort of
it's a little bit of a dark place. Yeah.
You laugh because it's true, right? Mm-hmm. Because it's also laughter and pain are connected. But we're moving away from the difference between poetry and prose, because I think that I play I personally like to play with those things. And I also like to play, circling all the way back to that spoken word thing. I like to play with like this idea that I am talking to an audience, and I do a lot of rhetorical call outs in my essay where I chat directly to the audience. Was that question about the lyrical love child?
The lyric essay as the love child of prose and poetry, of essay and poetry. And I think that's absolutely true. I think if you look at the sort of the long, non-lineated kind of line or poems that Camille was talking about, or just the proliferation of these lyric essays, the distinction between them is almost nothing, right? Maybe in terms of the full length, but my friend Kristen Case writes these really long, complicated investigations of language and philosophy and what it means to be a mom and what it means to be a woman. And their poems, their prose, or something like Dan Beachy Quick, right?
Claudia Rankine, Maggie Nelson. There's so many. I mean, in both of those two, Claudia Rankine and Maggie Nelson, still, they self-identify as poets, and what they're writing is very frequently, they will also self-identify as a lyric essay, right? And so it's this other space.
Citizen won the award for poetry and nonfiction, right? Was it the NBA, right?
Right.
It's certainly worthy of that book, those words, but like that book is a perfect example of this thing that exists in both worlds. So yeah, I think the question is really on point.
I think there's a quote from the writer James Lagenbach, who has this book called it's like the art of the poetic line or something like that. It's a book by Grey Wolf, and I'm going to misquote it slightly. But the general gist of the quote is it's about lineation. And he says that poetry is thoughts broken into lines. Prose is thoughts broken into sentences. And prose poetry is what we had to invent when neither of these two categories were sufficient, right? And I think that we could use a similar kind of, there's this for prose and this for poetry, and then those two things are insufficient containers for the capacity of the human mind. And so we have this other love child, as that question says, of the two, when both of those packages are insufficient.
Mm-hmm.
I know you said you've retrained yourself when you became a mother. What helpful changes did you make? So I will say that one of the most helpful changes that I made was I stopped thinking that I had to be the kind of writer who went into her office at 8 a.m., right when she woke up, without anything sullying my mind, and stayed there until 4 o'clock, like I was like punching a 9-to-5 kind of time clock, right? It's just not a life I'm going to get to have for another, my kid's 10 now. So I've got, probably about 8, yeah, right. And like at least 8 to 10 more years, but Jeffrey's kid's supposedly away at college, and he's telling me not to hope on that. Yeah. So, right. So that's gone, right? That idea. And I became much, much better at being able to write in quick bursts. So a lot of guidebook to relative strangers happened writing 20 minutes a day. That's it. That's all I had. But I made sure to write 20 minutes a day. Right now, I have a little bit more time, so I'm 1,000 words a day. I have to just get 1,000 words a day out of my brain and into the computer. And so that kind of shorter time frame to be able to learn how to record things. And you would see, if you read my third book compared to my fourth book, you will see a difference in the ways that the moments of experience are tapped into and touched on. You can tell that they are quicker bursts of attention. And I'm not talking about the revision experience, which is a totally different kind of way of thinking something, but I'm talking about how things get grabbed out of my brain and put onto the page. I had to train myself to do it with a much more immediate experience. So for my students, for instance, when I'm teaching, I am the one in my program who demands that my students write a poem a week. And if I'm teaching nonfiction, that they write an essay just about every week or every other week, which is exhausting and difficult and hard. And a lot of them are horrible when they go back to look at them lately. But what I'm trying to do is counter my own version of training, which was like, you have a month and a half to create the perfect poem. And instead be like, look, you've got this many hours, go. Just get what you want out. And so that's my suggestion. Oh, we got two questions that bounce right off each other. What are some good ways to draw inspiration for writing poetry? Was one of the questions. Jeffrey, you want
to? I think to live well and to pay attention to your life is the best inspiration, because there's stuff all around you. There's stuff in the language. There's stuff in everything. So I'm not a huge believer in inspiration. I'm sort of more like Camille, that, writing is about putting your butt in a chair for X period of time and doing some things, and maybe understanding that those first things are not going to be great or perfect, and not even expecting them to be great or perfect, but just sitting down in your chair and working on things and listening to what you're saying, to your words are saying, and then trying to make those things better and reading widely to support that, and to see what other people are doing with that same space. Because if you wait for inspiration, it might come, and you should take it when it does, because it's nice, it's a gift, but it doesn't have to be there to be a writer, whatever that means. Writing means that being a writer means you're writing, and you can do that whether you will feel inspired or not.
And if your muscles aren't stretched, if you're not ready, if you haven't been playing and thinking about form and structure and how you use tense, and you haven't been doing all those things, then the inspiration strikes and you can't do anything with it. You don't have the skills to correctly manipulate these things. And I feel like a way of connecting what Jeffrey's just said to this question of prose versus poetry, I used to play piano. And I had an amazing teacher. One of the reasons that I quit was that I moved to a different place and I couldn't find a teacher like her. And one of the things that was so good about Mrs. Godfrey was that she trained me in the classical mode of how to play the piano, but she also realized that kind of bored me. And so she gave me access to a lot of contemporary music and jazz and other genres of music that were exciting and challenging and different. And so that's part of what Jeffrey and I are saying, is that sometimes poetry is the shape that what we're thinking needs to arrive in. But sometimes we need to shift genres and play a different kind of melody and a different kind of rhythm, which is what prose offers to us, right? And so my best inspiration, or my best suggestion for finding inspiration as a writer, period, is to follow your mind and just see where your mind wants to take you, as opposed to putting that limit on it that you have to follow, you have to do it in some particular way. Do I think that poetry requires you to be mature or have life experiences, or do I think the poetry is available even to young people who have not experienced much of the world? I have so many thoughts about this, Keisha. Do you, Jeffrey, have thoughts? Like, I feel like that is the question right there, right? Like, I thought when I was young that I didn't have material for writing poetry, but I loved writing poetry, but I just didn't have the life that I had seen that poets were supposed to have. I had a really comfortable middle-class life with 2 healthy, happy, kind, loving parents in a lovely suburb where all the houses looked the same. That didn't seem to be like what poetry of young lives was going to be. But you know what? The world is full of experience. The world is full of really exciting, interesting, frictionful stories. And so my first 2 books are entirely persona poems. They're about other people. They're not about me. And I learned a lot about how to write a poem by writing through other people's lives. And by the time I finally turned to my own life, I had the things about which to write. What about you, Jeffrey? I guess we're close to time.
Yeah, I don't know what the Flannery O'Connor line comes to mind. Like, if you lived through childhood, you have enough to write about for the rest of your life. Like that, I think that sort of is. I worry about that too. Like, oh, I'll wait to write my poems when I know what they are and know. Then I'll know, and I'll just go up and sort of transcribe them from my head to the page. To me, that's not the way poetry works, and not the way most writing works, but poems in particular. And what I mean is that I don't go into a poem thinking I know exactly where I'm gonna end up. And so I start with something that interests me, a line, a sound, an image, or something that just somewhere I want to go. And I let that play out. And sometimes that plays out in other images. Sometimes it plays out in sentences and language. Sometimes it plays out with me on the computer going and looking up things about, about the periodic table, or about the history of the Rolling Stones in Tangiers, or about these different birds, or about whatever, the things that I don't know. And then I find more things and I can write about, and I follow a chain till it goes somewhere. So the idea that I had this experience and then wrote it down isn't the way that poems work, for me at least. That I start somewhere and I really try to follow it, follow my thinking, follow my mind, as Camille says, rather than, because if you go to a poem thinking you know the answer, probably the answer is going to be less interesting. It's going to be something sort of obvious. It's conventional wisdom. But if you go to the poem and let the language and let the process play out, then you'll find, when you find something at the end, that'll be a discovery, that'll be new, that'll be something that you didn't necessarily know. And so you can't claim that as experience or maturity. You get there by following the breadcrumbs of your own brain.
And other people's brains, right? I mean, we like, and research and doing that sort of exploration and seeing again how your personal experience connects with global experience and experiences that are wider than your own. Time for one more question, they say. Are there any craft books or essays that you find yourself returning to? Lots of them.
Yeah. Heather McHugh's Broken English, Rod Santos, A Poetry of Two Minds.
Audre Lorde's Sister Outsider. For me, I go back to again and again. I used to read Letters to a Young Poet every 5 years. And I did that recently, and I am no longer a young poet. So there are some times where you're like, oh, I've aged out of that one. But you know, I'm almost 50, so that carried me for a long time from about 15 to.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I just think, I think that there are a lot of people writing just in such interesting ways about what it means to be a writer in the world and a human in the world. And so there I get back to that eclectic, voracious reading. That's the key in all things.
Yeah, I mean, any book that you read can be a craft book if you think about the craft behind the writing, right? The Yeats line from Adam's Curse, which says, I'm not gonna get it exactly right, but if our line seems not a moment's thought, then all our stitching and unstitching has been for naught. I go back to that line a lot, and I think about what he means there is that any kind of writing, any writing that you do has to seem like it's this sort of natural, fluid, perfect expression. And this is why we sort of think of writers as geniuses, even though most of them are smart people and engaged. I mean, Camille's a genius, but that they're willing to sit in a room and work on sentences till they sound natural, and that they make this chain of thought, this breadcrumb pattern, seem sort of inevitable and surprising. And that's not, I don't think, necessarily something that just comes. It doesn't just arrive, or it doesn't arrive very often. But it comes from craft. So anything you read can be a craft book if you pay attention to the way it's put together.
Well, we're being told that that's it. We have to wrap up. But Jeffrey and I could just talk all day and all night. But there's an amazing next panel with Tom DiMarchi and John Dufresne. I can never pronounce his name, but I love his work and his ideas. And Beth Ann Finley. And stick around for that, because that's going to be great too. Thanks, Sanibel Island, for having us virtually.
Yep. Lovely talking to you.